Hi, I'm Val, and I'm a graphic design professor turned graphic design coach. And today I want to share with you a little bit about my philosophy on creativity and graphic design and where ideas and inspiration comes from, as well as in the process showing you some case studies and examples of my work, as well as some previous student work. So, it's going to be a little story with some chapter summaries, basically. But I grew up in a time where we had these magnificent objects. I really, really loved this yellow banana phone, and I wanted it so bad, but I wasn't allowed to have a phone in my room. So it was something that we had to deal with this long cord that was attached to the wall, basically. But it also meant that it was this kind of separation of time and compartmentalizing our itinerary throughout the day. You could leave someone a message on one of these handy little devices, and you weren't expected to call someone immediately back. We screened our phone calls like that Gwen Stefani's song. Um, but we also did this kind of thing. We interacted with the card catalog, mazes and mazes, depending on how big the library was. And it's a really interesting process of how you're using your brain to connect ideas together. You start with whatever your paper research is about, and you are trying to go through and uncover all of these different pathways, and it's a little adventure. You even find historical card catalog items like this with beautiful hand lettering on them. But the card catalog basically had a lot of interesting information in the way things were set up, and you had to kind of decode that. And then you're getting material and digging deeper and deeper and deeper. One thing leads to another, you're making connections between thoughts and subject matters, and you might only find, a chapter or a page worth quoting in the book and the material that you're collecting. But in general, it was a giant scavenger hunt. I just loved doing this kind of research and exploring my brain through these topics. And if you look at books, when we had to check them out back then, they've got this funky card, in the back that you pull out. And what's really cool about these now, if we look upon them as a past artifact, they actually tell a story within themselves. They tell a story about who took the object out and had some sort of interaction or relationship with it, which is really super fun from a nerdy perspective about telling stories. I also found this really fun chart illustration about, kind of the olden days of early internet kind of concepts of video and connecting things together in a library. But in essence, when you think about this, and design is a problem-solving process, it really needs to continue to be this deep dive into a subject matter. It's a really exciting field because you can explore all sorts of different topics. You can learn about math and history and science and sociology and anthropology, all by the different types of problems that you're encountering, that you're trying to solve. So it's a giant scavenger hunt. Now this poster is an example of something that I designed a few years ago. I organized a presentation with a friend of mine named Pash, who had published a book about creative inspiration. This was a book filled with interviews of designers in their space. So what I did was, instead of using images from the book, I wanted to think about a metaphor, which is one of the rhetoric devices that you can use when you're working in problem solving. So I love to collect objects, and I had this bag full of maps that were turned into stationery. I pulled that out, scanned them in, and voila, I had textures that I could use that were this beautiful color palette. And I utilized the shapes of commonly known speech bubbles to indicate that these were a lot of different stories. So I'm using these subtle tendencies to kind of connote the idea of talking in stories. Now, a few years ago, I attended an AIJ design conference. AIJ is the Professional Association for Graphic Design. They have had a conference every other year since I think the late 90s. And last year they started to do them every year. So this one that I attended was in New Orleans, and they have this event called Command X. So what they're doing with the Command X is people who are recently graduated, probably in their mid-20s, apply or are recommended for this game show. It's kind of like a cross between Project Runway and Project Runway with like Tim Gunn and some of the other design shows where you have competition and every day you are eliminating certain people. So they only have a limited amount of time to resolve the projects. And the first project that they get is based on the city in which the conference is held. So in this case, New Orleans, the first assignment was a voodoo museum. So the presentations all started kind of blending together for me, and I had a little aha moment. When I got home, I decided that this was an important lesson for my students and to share with you. I started to Google some things because I was a little bit suspicious about the solutions that were being presented. In any case, this is an image of the original sign for the Voodoo Museum. Now, you need to remember that the participants in this competition are given a week to do this. They're given the name of the client, and that at the event, the client is actually there to help judge the work. So I started looking at these, and they all started kind of blending together. They all seemed really similar, and a lot of the presentations, they basically would say, I researched the Voodoo Museum, and then I researched voodoo, and then these are the elements that I came up with, and this is why I chose these designs. So you can see here with all of the different solutions that the participants in this competition had come up with. So they have to get up on stage and sell their work, explain their rationale of why they designed these in a different way. And at some point, there's a dialogue between the judges, like on Project Runway, and the competitors. And the owner of the Voodoo Museum was also there. And every single time he had his hand up and he wanted to make some comments, but the host never called on him until kind of the third or fourth person in. And what he ended up saying was, that's not New Orleans voodoo, that's Haitian voodoo. And the entire crowd kind of gasped. So what was happening was there's designers on the stage and they're throwing all this like love and, you know, this is so beautiful, blah, 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 blah. Because they're just focused on the aesthetics, when in actuality the client is saying you haven't solved the problem at all because you're not even dealing with the correct subject matter. So what I did was I went home and I Googled voodoo. So here are the images I'm going to show you of Googling voodoo. And you can see here at the top, there's pictures, and then there's this thing called symbols. So I'm like, okay. All of these competitors had something very, very similar. They all showed these symbols in their process. What does this look like? So it's a Google first search. It's the first layer. It's the cherry on the top of the ice cream. It's not a deep dive. So here's the next image, voodoo symbols. So this is what comes up with voodoo symbols. Now, none of those competitors ever picked up the phone to call Jerry and talk to him about his voodoo museum. They basically went to the first image that they saw for voodoo, and they didn't even click on that to find out more information. So herein lies a problem. So let's move on and look at a case study. Unlike the competitors in the AIJ CommandX example that I just shared with you, I was able to speak directly to a client. So Tinker Bristol is a nonprofit organization, a makerspace that is being developed in the state of Rhode Island. I got connected to them through a colleague of mine, and the first thing I did was call the client. I was really wanted to make sure that I had an idea from them of the direction for this logo and brand story, basically. So they're a makerspace, and they're creating this in a giant warehouse in an old industrial area that used to be part of the Industrial Revolution, that particular area of the country. Bristol, Rhode Island, Pawtucket, Rhode Island, Fall River, Massachusetts was all the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And what Tinker Bristol was trying to do, and is in the process of doing now, a few years later, is creating a space for people to come and utilize equipment and tools that maybe they couldn't afford to have in their garage, for example. So after speaking to the main director of this organization, I went back and reflected upon some of the presentations that I've participated and seen, design history knowledge that I know about, and I recalled this idea of the old Nickelodeon logo. This is not the Nickelodeon logo now, but at the time, this was designed by Adams Morioka out in California. And what I love about this logo is that it had iconographic systems where you could interchangeably use all of these different little marks, you know, blurbs and rockets and all kinds of different shapes, and it was all interchangeable as an identity system. So what I decided to do was look up and do that research, kind of like the Voodoo Museum, but a little bit deeper. And I came up with some key words. So the first one was an incubator. What is an incubator? What does it look like? What does that mean? So incubator and an industrial thing. And what I love about this incubator is if you notice on this, there's these kind of layers, right? So it looks like a building. The inside of an incubator of the example that I'm showing has that reference. The next idea I had was this plastic frame game pieces that they still make today. The way that the objects are connected and can be interchangeable is a concept that I thought was pretty interesting. So I found some examples of this with signage. So not only is their logo going to be on a piece of paper, but how does that identity system transform into the physical space? How can they transcend it into their brand story once someone is immersed in their tinker space? The next idea I had was templates and spirographs. So one of the things that they were really trying to promote is the process of creativity and ideas, not the end product. So I was looking at these things like templates as being an indicator of that creative exploration. And I also really loved the colors that were included in all of these little plastic pieces that I remember having in, geometry class and these different things, and spirographs, and the experimental process and the kind of joy that comes from that playfulness. The next idea I had was thinking about the actual physical tools that they might have within their space. So laser cutting and how are things organized. So I found images of tools, images of colored things that were stored, examples of laser cutting. Now I started to think about this concepts in a typographic form as well. So the beginning stages of this were transferring those ideas like a stencil or the little attachment pieces into the typography. So this first example of Type Thoughts 1 is me going out and exploring and finding examples of this with various type foundries. Now, computers have typography that is inherently, default, and it comes with the computer. But a good design is going to be something that is really thoughtful holistically through the typography as well. So Type Thoughts 2 is examples of some type that I found that had the little pieces, the little edges to them that kind of reminded me of that plastic. So here are some examples of these in process, right? So connectors. The tinker replaces that plastic toy element. The next one is the stencil idea, and integrating these industrial objects within the shapes. The third one is the industrial building transformation. So I'm really trying to capture the notion of creative generation without going to that, kind of the fallback of a lightning bolt or a light bulb, which is typically used to reference ideas, right? But it's a cliche idea. So here on the right hand side, you can see that I use these like swirly shapes that are indicative and inspired by spirographs and the stencils, but they're not literally spirographs. On the other side, on the left, I kind of took the idea of industrial building with the windows and tried to make a transformation of shapes. The next page is more explicitly a spirograph combined with the stencil idea, and just wanted to show them in a first draft all these different types of silly little arrows and silly little shapes that could represent that idea of interchangeable parts and the spirograph kind of concept. The next example is pulling that together in a little bit more industrial signage with including kind of historical hand pointing and arrows that are referencing this historical time that they're trying to kind of give a nod to, an ode to this maker industrial past, but in a kind of more high-tech futurism. So the little pointing hands is just a kind of a nod to that. So when you say visualizing ideas, a lot of people, like I mentioned, will automatically go to that first concept, which is most often a light bulb or something above someone's head. So this example that I'm showing you is often what you will find in that preliminary Google search, you know, where you're just doing a surface thing and you just grab an image and, you know, you stick it on there. But we want to go deeper. So I made a formal presentation to the committee. Now I had no idea who the committee was going to be. This is a small community, and they invited me to someone's house. We're sitting around an old dining table, rockety chairs, on my laptop. So let's see if I, you know, on my laptop, like open up, like trying to show people the presentation and hopefully articulate these concepts that I'm explaining to you in that process, because I really wanted to have make sure that I was going in an appropriate direction, and because this was a pro bono project, not getting paid for it, I didn't want to spend hours and hours and hours of my time on something that may not be the right direction and I needed to start over. So I made a formal presentation to the committee. I start out my formal presentations with the definition of tinkering, this notion of repairing, adjusting, and experimenting. I explained to them that we're doing an homage to the industrial maker past, but recognizing the transition and the transformation of the makerspace future. They really want a community space and a place for ideas and innovation. So this was something that I did in 2014 that I'm happy to share with you. So again, here's some of the layouts that I showed them. I kind of went through and explained all of these different concepts and showed them the images of the incubator and the plastic pieces and the stencils and the toolboxes and that sort of thing. And then I gave them these concepts. So version 1. Version 1 is the like the stencil with the architectural shapes with the industrial building, which is kind of feedback that I got from the client in between this stage. So I had originally sent him the typography and some of those initial sketch ideas, got some feedback from him on that. He settled on wanting the industrial building as a primary icon, and we looked at some of the other tools like hammers and that sort of thing. So I was given the direction that stencil was kind of the way to go. The client narrowed down the typography and the concepts for me. And this is how I translated that conversation. So version 1 has the option of being positive, negative. It is the reference to the little plastic pieces with the lines, and then I integrated the building and the arrows. And I also, in each of my presentation versions, wanted to give them an example of like how this would translate into signage or additional components, postcards or posters or that type of thing. So again, version 1 is referencing those plastic plastic game pieces where everything is attached to it. So you could take, like the Nickelodeon logo, you can take all the different pieces and rearrange them in different orders. So that's version 1. Okay, and I also shared with them how that would look on their letterhead and their stationery package. And this one is like a postcard. Again, some postcards here. Coming soon. That's one of the things that they wanted to do. Okay, version 2 takes the stencil idea in a different way. So these are the more separated pieces of stencils. Now, I am not a huge fan of stencil lettering, especially the stencil typefaces that are the default on the computer. Get away from those. So what I did was I found some better stencil typography. It's an ode and the homage to the industrial past, because that's how things were, you know, shipping things are used with stencils. So this one uses the more of like the boxes of the stencil, and I put the icons in the square shape. Now these can also be interchangeable, as noticed by the different system. And again, another example of the letterhead and stationery package. Now this postcard example, on the right hand side, you'll notice that I'm using a very fun neon type colors, kind of referencing spray paint, as well as not being a solid object. So thinking about how ideas are not solid, right? It's the imagination. It is something that isn't complete. It's ethereal. So you can see that by utilizing the spray paint action and that softness, that is intended to convey that concept. Version 3 is a different version of the stencil, and this one I used a little bit more abstract with the arrow. I had 2 different typefaces for the stencil. I personally prefer the one on the left. The one on the right is a little bit chunkier, but you know, it does the same job. Now on this one, you'll see that on the left-hand side there's notches. That is a reference to that incubator idea, but also to the maker pass. So that is actually a joint that is used in traditional carpentry that doesn't need nails. So what I did was I took that concept of the shape and I abstracted that. So that's what you're seeing in this. In the middle of the slide, you're going to see the use of the ruler and those really fun architectural templates kind of sticking in there. And then the gentleman had made a sketch for me of what his idea was with a toolbox. So I wanted to integrate a toolbox into this concept, just so that I was making sure that I was, giving him a nod that I was listening to him as a client. So here is an example of the stationery for concept number 3. And then the second version of concept number 3 with the little notches on the side. I also shared with them on this one his illustration, kind of verbatim, with the logo on the outside. And I've been thinking about how you would put those objects in to an actual space. So here is the color concepts based off of the templates and the spirographs. So even if an idea might get shot down for the physical mark, the actual little, marks on the page, I'm still taking an inspiration from that for the colors. So you can see on the left of this is the references of all the different inspiration and then some ideas on paper color. And for them to be able to afford, being a nonprofit, they can buy buy the pretty colored paper and actually print things through a laser printer. So everything is black and white. The logo is intentionally black and white for that purpose. The logo doesn't have color necessarily unless it's applied in a different way. So on the collateral inspiration, I also wanted to show them some historical examples. And this is why design history is so important for creative people. If you can understand where the historical attributes and how that related to the social cultural context of the time, you might be able to utilize that in not only explaining it to your client, but also in the design. So you can see a variety of things here. For example, the middle one that has art chantry on it, it has that ethereal quality of that opacity, the spray paint idea where I could layer the icons, versus maybe the one here in the bottom left middle where it's the stacking of the building. So it's an architectural reference, it's a reference to the incubator. The urbanized and Helvetica posters are also another example for creative inspiration for the client to understand how they could utilize the icons in a graphic format. But then on the right hand side, there's also the ode to the industrial past. So thinking about Rosie the Riveter and Art Deco posters that were designed in that kind of more industrial time period. Now I gave them all of those in addition to the environmental inspiration. So how could you use like laser cutting to, put signs on the walls? You could go and do thrifting, which is something that I love to do, and find old toolboxes and put them in the bathroom and have that be where there's paper towels or something like that. So there's a lot of options here that I was trying to give them with the decor. So I'm sure you're wondering which example they chose. They chose, and I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to show you the slide. They chose the stencil one with the blocks. So they really liked the idea of how you could use spray paint and the ethereal quality of that. So that's the one that they chose. So thank you for going on a little bit of a journey with me today as I told a few stories. I have moved from professor to coach a long time ago as a graphic designer, but most recently in June of 2018 decided to walk away from that academic institution for various reasons, problems that I saw as an internal situation, lack of ability to interact with all of the students that I had, to be able to reach more people like you. So one of my goals for this video was to kind of talk about graphic design and unveil some of the behind the scenes, what goes on in the creative process. The world we live in today, everything is designed. We see packaging, we see logos, we see signage, and I just want to make sure that people understand, if you're interested in learning more about graphic design, that it's not just about sprinkling magic fairy dust onto a computer and voila, you have a solution. As a perfect example that I decided to show you was what I thought was kind of an issue with a professional design conference and esteemed designers who are well known in the industry lavishing praise over an aesthetic when the client was sitting right there saying, these have no bearing on what my business is. So we live in a world where information is so accessible that we become kind of lazy in the idea of just Googling something and grabbing that first image and not digging deep. So I really wanted to give you a little bit of background about myself and where I'm coming from and what I believe growing up with the phone attached to the wall and learning how to use the card catalog enabled me to be a different type of thinker, to go on these scavenger hunts, and I would like to share that process with you. if you're interested. Then I decided to share with you a case study with a nonprofit that I worked on. Now, this was not intended to say this is the only answer. Graphic design does not have one only answer. I wanted to share with you my methodology, my problem solving for that particular case study. And to reiterate the idea that ideas kind of come from different places, how we need to communicate to the client through the design process before you come up with the final product. But that every good design solution has an idea that has been really hashed out and worked out behind the scenes and before the final product kind of lives out there in the world. So I do have a second portion of this video, if you want to look for it, where I'm explaining more about one class in particular that I've designed called Taste, and some other examples of my own design work, so that as a coach you can understand the type of work that I would do. So just like you're going to hire a lifestyle coach or a coach at the gym, kind of want to know what their background is. So that's what the next video is intended to do, to share with you some examples of student work and some more examples of my work in this concept of being a scavenger hunt, design thinker, Wonder Wandering, which is my creativity retreat center, Camp Wonder Wander. So again, thank you for your time. Please subscribe if you want to find out more information about graphic design, as I'll be posting more and more as the weeks and months go by. And if you're interested in a coaching session, I'm offering free consultations. Go to my website, www.coachvalsloan.com, and I look forward to meeting you.